أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So we as human beings make a lot of claims. Among the many claims that we make is the claim of love. We claim to love a lot of things. When we seek the path of so-called spirituality, we are claiming to love something greater than ourselves. But like the great poet said, love is like a lawsuit. It requires evidence. What is the evidence of love? What is the direct consequence of this powerful emotion? Think for a moment about human love. What happens when someone is in love with another person? That person will desire nothing more than to serve, please, and be close to the one that they love. And this service is not motivated by begrudging obligation, but rather a deep inner drive born directly out of that love. Love speaks for itself. When you love someone, you do what pleases them. And your greatest joy is in pleasing and serving the one you love. It's an honor to serve the one you love. Imagine for a moment that you're in the presence of a famous person. So you're walking down in Hollywood or something and you come across, okay, I'm just going to use the example of Kobe. You may or may not care about that, but you see Kobe. And how do people act when they see a famous person or someone they really love? What they do is they go up to them, can I get you something? You know, if you're in the presence of a king or you're in the presence of a celebrity, it's let me serve you. Can I get you some? Can I just get you a cup of water? Can I tie your shoe? Right? And then you'll go home and you'll tell everyone that you tied Kobe's shoe. Now you may not care about Kobe, but you understand the sentiment here. There is an honor in serving the one you love. There is tashrif. And it is only once the love is gone or weakened that serving that person goes from being an honor to just being a burden. It goes from tashrif to only taklif. Sadly, our claim of love for God is like this. To claim spirituality, we are claiming love. But love of what? To claim spirituality without obedience to the one you claim to love is really just worship of the self. It's just like another form of high. This is why people will run after the type of spirituality that gives them a buzz and abandon a deed the moment it stops providing the buzz. The question we have to ask ourselves is, are we worshiping God or are we worshiping the spiritual high, the buzz? If you really want to know what you love, look at what you obey. Look at what you serve. Look at what you strive for. Remember that our actions are just external manifestations of our inner image, of the image of the heart. How we act is dictated by what we love. It is dictated by what is filling our heart. Remember that what you love is what you obey, and what you obey is an indication of what you truly love. So be careful what you love. And everyone loves something, and so everyone obeys something. The question is, what do you or I love most? Because that is what we will obey most. If it's another person that you love most, that will be what you obey most. If it's the image in front of people, your actions will be dictated by what will provide you with the best image. If it's money that you love most, you will sacrifice haram and halal to make more of it. If it's getting married that you love most, and people tell you, for example, that you won't get married if you wear hijab, then you won't wear hijab. Remember that we are outside, and what we are outside is a reflection of what we are and what we love inside. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, قُلْ كُلٌّ يَعْمَلُ عَلَى شَاكِلَتِهِ. Now this ayah, I'm going to translate it, and then I'm going to talk about, there are different levels of meaning to this ayah that scholars have talked about. Very deep message here. The translation is that, say to the Prophet ﷺ, everyone acts according to shakilati. So shakilati is the inner image. So you will act the way you are inside. So you will act outside the way you are inside. And if you actually look at the definition of khuluq, the definition of khuluq, which is usually translated as manners, the definition of khuluq is this: هيئة راسخة في النفس تصدر عنها العمل والأقوال بسهولة بدون تكلف. What this means is it's an internal or engraved entity inside of you that manifests itself in your sayings and in your doings without any kind of like striving. You don't have to try hard. It's just it's the way you act immediately. It's kind of your knee-jerk reaction. And what that knee-jerk reaction, the way you act, is a manifestation of what you are engraved inside. So your actions are dictated by this inner image. But there's like a deeper level that Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah talks about in his station of irada. Irada means what you want, what you strive for, what you seek. And he says that you'll actually be inside, you'll take on the form of what you seek, of what you want. So if what you want is something low, if what you want is just the dunya and something low, that's the form that you take internally. You become that way. And if what you want and what you seek is something lofty and something great, then that's the form that you take internally. And so what he says, and in describing, for example, the meaning of the word, one of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes is al-akhir. And we know that this means the end, the last, right? The end, al-akhir and al-awwal. Al-akhir, one of the understandings of this attribute, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be our final irada, our last and final irada. So when we seek a degree, okay, we seek, if someone comes and asks you, what do you want? What do you want from life? What do you seek? And you might say, okay, I seek a certain degree. I want to graduate from college. Okay, what after? Then you get there, then what? Now I want a good job. That's what I want. But then once you get there, then what? Okay, I want to make a lot of money. I want a big car. I want a big house. I want a nice car. Once you get to these things, there's always an end. There's always an end to these things because these are limited things. And so what we should do is make the final, our final and last irada, our final and last thing that we seek should be al-akhir, should be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we cannot separate love from worship. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the purpose of our creation, He says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. So we go through this life and people ask this question all the time. Why am I here? What am I doing? Where am I going? Where did I come from? These are questions that you ask if you're awake, right? If you're paying attention. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers this question for us in the Quran. And He says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have not created jinn and human beings for any other purpose, for any other reason except ubudiyya, except to fulfill ubudiyya to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then the question is, what is ubudiyya? Do we not need to know what is our purpose of creation? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us it's ubudiyya. When explaining what is the meaning of ubudiyya, scholars such as Ibn Qayyim and Ibn Taymiyyah say that ubudiyya has two parts. Thamam al-mahabba, that's the first part. Thamam al-mahabba, the perfection of love. Along with thamam, so you have the perfection of love, مع thamam al-ta'a, and al-madillah. So this means the perfection of love along with the perfection of humility and obedience. That is ubudiyya. So to fulfill our purpose, we have to have both love and obedience. There is no ibadah without love. Therefore, there is no fulfillment of our purpose without love, without filling our heart with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So my advice to you and to me is guard your heart. Be careful of what enters your heart. Be careful of what fills your heart, because your heart is very holy ground. There's something very holy about the heart. The heart is the seat of divine love and experience. None of us can see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with our physical eyes, right? We can't see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is only with the heart that you can see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is only with the heart. And there's a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he says that in this world there are vessels. And the vessels of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are the hearts of the Salihin. That in the heart is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be received. But think about this. You would never invite a king into a dirty house, because a king does not enter a dirty house. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the nearness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not enter a dirty heart. So if we want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our heart, and if we want to be and to fulfill the purpose of our creation, to fulfill our ubudiyyah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have to clean our hearts. We have to guard our hearts and be careful what it is that's filling our hearts. We have to be careful of what type of ilah we carry in our hearts. I want to share one thing with you, and I want, inshallah, us to ponder on this. When the heart is cleaned of anything that competes with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, something really amazing happens. Everything that the person now loves will be through, by, and because of Allah. And then you will be left loving only what Allah loves and not loving what Allah does not love. Once this happens, obedience is a direct consequence, because your love is in line with Allah, what Allah loves. And this is why there's a very beautiful dua where we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allahumma inni urid an la urid illa ma turid. Oh Allah, I seek, I want that I do not want except what you want. That's all we want. Oh Allah, I want that I do not want except what you want. That is the heart that's cleaned of anything competing with the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with any ilah competing with the only ilah. La ilaha illallah. Consider this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in talking about the nearness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Hadith Qudsi, He tells us that the abd, the slave, does not do anything more endearing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala other than the fara'id. The fara'id are first, the obligations. Those are the things which Allah loves most. And when that abd continues to do those things and then does the nawafil, the supererogatory, the extra prayers, the extra fasts, that person continues to do those things until something amazing happens. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, until I love that servant. So how do we get the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? We focus on the fara'id first, and then we add the nawafil, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves that servant. And once that happens, now this is amazing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, then I become his hearing with which he hears, his sight with which he sees, his hand with which he strikes, and his feet with which he walks. In this hadith, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing a state where everything you do, subhanahu wa ta'ala, we talk about trust, meaning tawakkul, having full reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We talk about humility. We talk about the concept of rida, for example, the concept of sabr, rida meaning contentment with the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sabr, patience, perseverance. All of these different stations on the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they either lead up to the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they are a result of the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So everything else, every other station leads us or is a means to get to the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or it is a fruit of that love. And if we, a lot of times we as believers, and we might get to a point where we want to devote our lives, to becoming better. We want to strengthen our deen. We want to better ourselves. And a lot of times what keeps us from taking that path is that it looks really hard. It looks like it's a very, from the outside, when you look at, sometimes from the outside, when you look at Islam, all you see is, like everything's haram, it's too hard, it's a lot easier to just not be religious. And there's this deception that people have about what it means to devote your life to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the truth is that if you really want to take the easiest path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it really is this path. It's the path of love. And when I say that, what I mean is that if you think about the example of another human being, that what happens if you compare, like how you are, how difficult it is to be kind and giving and generous when you love someone versus when you don't love them. So if you think of an example in your own life, of a person in your life who is very dear to your heart, someone who you absolutely love, maybe more than anyone else in the world, and then you think about how easy it is to
to give to that person, how easy it is to sacrifice for that person. And sometimes you'll even be willing to give up your own comfort for the sake of their comfort. And sometimes you'll just, you'll sacrifice your own happiness to make them happy. And this is something that when you really love someone isn't even very difficult to do. It's just sort of a natural consequence of love. And if you compare that to a situation where you don't really love the person, but you sort of feel obligated to the person, and it's a lot harder. At that point, sacrificing is much more difficult. You're basically going to just do the minimum for that person. You're not going to go above and beyond for that person because you don't really love them. I mean, you don't have that regard for them, and so to give to them is a struggle, and it's especially difficult if it means self-sacrifice. But if you go back to the example of the one who you love, and especially if you're in love with someone, is that when you're at that point, it becomes very easy. It becomes easy to not only give to that person, but it becomes very easy to remember that person. And in fact, if you think about a situation where someone is in love, it's not like they have to be reminded of the one that they love. It's like kind of like they have to get some, you need help to stop thinking about the one you're in love with, not the other way around. And so when you think about the concept of love is a very, very strong motivator. And so when we look at how do we approach the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how do we approach this path to bettering ourselves or getting closer to Him, or, in quotation marks, being more religious. And really, I think that unfortunately a lot of us go about it in the wrong way. And even as children, I think we're taught as children, so much of what we're taught about Islam as children has to do with, oh, you're going to go to hell if you don't do this, right? You have to do this. This is haram, and this is haram. So everything, the image that's created as children for us, sometimes in Sunday school and all that, is that everything is haram, and I better not do it because if I do it, I'm going to go to hell. And so I think the big mistake in seeing Islam in this way is that it has nothing to do with love of Allah. It just has to do with, just trying to get myself out of hellfire. Just the idea of thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in such a way that, His attributes, which are most emphasized, are not emphasized in this way. When you just talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wrath and you just talk about hellfire, you start to see a skewed and very inaccurate picture of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I've seen a lot of times where children grow up in that way, where they're taught in this way, and it really just turns them off from the whole idea of being religious at all. And sometimes it completely turns them off from Islam. And it's like and a lot of times people, it's not until like they grow up and they go to college, and sometimes in their MSAs they'll come back to Islam. But it's kind of like I've seen this pattern a lot, where as children, because of the way they're taught about who Allah is and how we're supposed to worship Him, and it's so much of it is out of fear, so much of it is this image of a very wrathful type of God who is, He's going to punish you unless you do X, Y, and Z. And so people get very turned off by that. And then, a lot of times, alhamdulillah, through their MSAs, they start to see the other side of Islam and really the other side of God. And in fact, this is the most emphasized side of God. And so it's extremely dangerous to take that out of the whole equation. Now, when we think back to the idea of love, going back to the example of when you feel like, you really love somebody, and when you are in that state, again, everything you do for that person becomes much, much easier. It becomes very easy to remember that person, and it becomes very easy to sacrifice and give to that person. When we love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the worship that we do and the commitment that we make to Him becomes much, much easier because we love Him and we want to please Him and we want to be with Him. And so really that is the strongest motivator, and it needs to be our strongest motivator. In the example that was given, is, a lot of times people become sort of paralyzed by having either too much hope or having too much fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so what we're told to have is we have to have a balance between the fear and the hope, where we fear, for example, when we are, when we are committing sins, we should fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's anger, and that's part of taqwa. But at the same time, we should not allow that fear to paralyze us, because if that fear paralyzes us, we're not going to be able to change. We end up falling lower and lower and lower. And so what we have to do is let that fear actually drive us to get better, but not paralyze us. And the way to do that is to balance it with hope. Because hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, anytime that I am committing sins, I should not lose that hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive me. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us all of these attributes of His which have to do with forgiveness and love. And the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Jabbar, for example, which means one of the meanings of this attribute is the one who mends. And so if I'm broken, or I am, my deeds are by definition insufficient, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can mend them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most generous. So even when I'm giving Him, very insufficient ibadah, very insufficient worship, and yet He still gives and gives and gives of His gifts to me. And that's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most generous, and not because I deserve it. So inshallah, we'll take a short break now, and when we return, we'll continue on the topic of love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum, this is Yasmin Mogahed, and you're listening to Serenity, streaming live on One Legacy Radio. So before we return to the topic of love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I had a request on the chat box to sort of give an inspirational message for students. I guess a lot of students are dealing with midterms right now, and that's a stressful thing. I remember when I was a student. And it's interesting, actually, one really short, quick reflection about that is I know that when I was a student and I had an exam coming up, or I got a bad grade on an exam, or whatever happened, I remember at the moment that it was happening, I thought it was like the biggest deal in the world, like, oh my God, I have an exam tomorrow, or oh, I did really bad, or what are my grades, and this and that, and it becomes like very, very important, and it's something that you focus so much on, and you're sort of, it becomes sort of your whole world at that moment. And I'll just say this, that like once you are out of that moment, so many years later, you look back and it like totally didn't matter as much as you thought it did at the moment. So I just kind of want to give that reflection, having gone through it and then looking back, that particular moment where I was freaking out about a test, or I got it, in the grand scheme of things, it mattered very little to none. So I'm not saying that, you don't do your best, you do your best. But I am saying that, really like you do your best, but you just kind of are able to step outside of it and realize that it really isn't the, the beginning and end of the world. It's something that you're doing, and then inshallah it'll pass. But basically, what I would say for advice about anything that you do, basically, whether you're studying or you're working or anything that you're focused on or working at in this dunya, is just to make sure that your focus is clear and that your intentions are clear. Because the Prophet ﷺ told us that he basically gave us a prescription to be successful in this life as well as the next life. And that prescription is to actually make your primary concern and your focus not on this life. So when you're going in and you're taking a test, or you're studying, or you're working on your, whatever degree it is, you're doing that, but your goal is not about dunya. Your goal and your end should not be just to get that degree, or just to make a certain salary, or, to have a certain prestige in society. But your goal should be bigger than that, and greater than that, and better than that. And that is for the hereafter. And if you make that your goal, and you make that your primary concern, and where your focus is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make your matters easy for you. And this is based on the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he talks about the difference between the person who makes the dunya his primary concern versus the one who makes akhirah, hereafter, his primary concern. And the one who makes the primary concern and the goal and the focus, akhirah, the hereafter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually will join and make easy your affairs in this life. So always just remember, your priorities. One thing I want to point out is sometimes we don't get involved enough in things that will bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such as like study circles or going to lectures, or just basically being involved in these things because we have to study, or because we have we have all these commitments at school. And while obviously you're not supposed to abandon your commitments at school, but if you realize, like, if you always make it a priority to put Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first, you will find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put barakah, will put blessing even in your study time, and you can be able to do things in less time than you would otherwise, if you make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the priority. So it's just some reflections to think about. It is very important that you are involved along with your school with some consistent activity which is keeping you and bringing you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some type of dhikr, some type of consistent halaqah, for example, or something that you do regularly. That I cannot overemphasize that point. It's extremely important. We cannot build our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on just sporadic things that just we go to a lecture here, we go to we listen to something on YouTube once, but it needs to be consistent. Just like you need to consistently eat food in order to stay alive, you need to consistently have these remembrance, you need to consistently be working on your heart in order to keep it alive. So back to the topic of hope and fear and then love. There's a really beautiful statement of Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, in which he says, on his way to Allah, a believer's heart is likened to a bird. Love is its head. Fear and hope are its wings. Hence, when the head and wings are sound, the bird will perfectly fly. If the head is cut, the bird will die. And when he loses the wings, he will be inevitably objected to hunting. It's so, subhanAllah, Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, man. So he's talking here about a concept. It's just, it's deep. So here, if you think about, he's talking about that the head of the bird is love. So what is it that leads the bird? It's love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is what should be driving us. This is what should be leading us in our path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the wings, if you think about the wings now, what happens if one side of the wing is broken or weaker than the other side? Well, what happens now is the bird isn't as stable, and so it's more likely to be shot down. And this is a perfect analogy. If you think about a person who has too much fear, for example, and not enough hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you have too much fear, this is where you get a situation of I'm going to go to hell anyway, what's the point? People say things like that. What's the point? No matter what I do, I'm going to get punished. Or no matter what I do, I'm going to sin. Or no matter what I do, I'm going to fail. So what's the point in trying? It's this loss of hope because the fear is too strong and the hope is too weak. And if you look at that situation, now that person who has that mindset, are they motivated to really act? They're not. And that's because they don't have that proper balance. Now, if you look at the other side of it, where you have too much hope and not enough fear, when you have too much hope, this could be a situation where it's kind of like I can do whatever I want and I'm still going to be saved in the end, right? It doesn't matter because I can, you kind of have too much wishful thinking where you think that I can do whatever I want, act however I want. And then, it's kind of the idea of I can live my life however I want, and then before I die, I'll just say La ilaha illallah, and then I'll be fine. But the problem with this thinking is that at the time of death, for example, the only thing that you're going to be able to speak with your tongue is what's filling your heart. And so if your heart is, you lived your entire life just living for dunya and loving dunya, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was not in your heart, guess what? He's not going to be on your tongue when you're dying, because your tongue is going to speak what's in the heart. And so whatever your heart was attached to, that's what comes out at the time of death. And it's so interesting and it's actually very scary to look at people when they're dying, to look at what they say and how they act. And there are times, and I'm sure many of us have heard of these cases, where people at the time of death, they can't say La ilaha illallah. They're not able to. People around them keep telling them, say La ilaha illallah, repeat after me, say La ilaha illallah, and they're not able to say it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that person will not be allowed to say La ilaha illallah unless they had La ilaha illallah in their heart, unless that's what they lived. So what you live and what you carry inside is what you're going to end up seeing and what you're going to end up speaking at the time of death. So the whole idea of the bird is that it needs to be balanced, that the hope and the fear need to be balanced, and the love needs to drive the person. This is really what drives me is my love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that I want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I want to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having Him be pleased with me. And so on the topic of love, I want to actually mention a couple of hadith where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the issue of love of Allah for the slave and the love of the slave for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this is a hadith that I really, really love, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when Allah loves a servant, He calls Jibreel and says, I love so-and-so, so love him. And then Jibreel loves him. Then Jibreel, announces in the heavens saying, Allah loves so-and-so, so love him. Then the inhabitants of the heavens, so the angels, also love him. And then the people on earth love him. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't love someone, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes someone, thus He also starts to dislike him. Then the people object. Then the people become the object of hatred on earth as well. So here the hadith is, this is Bukhari and Muslim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying here that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has love for a person, He actually tells, imagine the honor of having Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala love you, that He tells Jibreel alayhi salam to love you, and then Jibreel alayhi salam tells the angels that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves you, and so they love you, and then the people on the earth love you. This is a consequence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's love. Now, the question now should be, how do we get the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How do we get this amazing, acquire this station where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves us? And there's a hadith which talks about this exact question, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's a hadith Qudsi, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that there's no action that a slave gets close to Him except by which is more beloved than those things which He has made obligatory. So the first part of this hadith is saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the action that Allah loves most in order to get close to Him are those actions which are actually fard, those actions which are obligatory. Now, I just want to make a quick reflection on this issue. A lot of times what we find in ourselves and people around us is that when we take this path and we want to start to be more religious and basically make the deen more important in our lives, sometimes we kind of overlook the fundamentals and we go for like these extra things. So this is a situation where a person might be, okay, they're very like excited and they're on this high, and so they want to get very involved, for example. So they might be involved in all these committees at the masjid and involved in activism, and they're kind of like pumped, right? And want to work for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then at the same time their salah is not really in order, or maybe they're involved in all these activities but they don't wake up for fajr. This is a situation where we have overlooked what is fard, what is obligatory, and we've gone to the things which are extra, the nawafil. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is explaining here that you start with the fundamentals, you start with the obligatory. And the reason why you start there is because that's what Allah loves most, because that's what He made fard. You see, like we sometimes overlook these things as if they're that's just, it's lesser because it's fard. But what we forget to realize is the reason He's made it obligatory is because that's the action He loves most. So when He says you pray fajr at a certain time, when He says you pray these 5 prayers at this time, the fasting and the zakah and these things, He has made those things obligatory for a reason. Those are the things which are most beloved to Him, and those are the things which will cure us and which will make our hearts healthy most. So this is kind of like the medicine. This is the strongest medicine, and the best medicine to take is the things that He has made obligatory. And then after that, the hadith goes on to say, and then my servant continues to draw near to me by the things which I have made nawafil, the extra things, the voluntary things. And so here now we're talking, so after you've done the fara'id, you've settled, you've gotten and you've you have the fundamentals down, then you continue to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through adding the extra things. This is where you add, the extra prayers, the extra fasts, getting involved in the community, etc., etc. And then after this, something amazing happens. And that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, until I love him. So now this is the point where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now loves the servant. And once Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves a servant, he says, I become his hearing with which he hears, his sight with which he sees, and his hand with which he strikes, and his feet with which he walks. And if he asks me something, I will surely give him. And if he seeks my protection, I will surely protect him. This hadith is powerful. This hadith talks about this process of getting to a point where not only do we love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves us. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves a servant, even his hearing and his seeing and his hand becomes a reflection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That everything this person does is reflecting of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's light. And so this is the station that we seek and we wish, inshallah, that we can reach. And this is the way to reach it. It is through, making sure that we have the fundamentals down, the fara'id down, and then inshallah continuing to add extra things until we get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves us. And I want to inshallah just end with another ayah of the Quran which links the two, the love that we have for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and then the love that he has for us. And that is the ayah that says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم قل إن كنتم تحبون الله فاتبعوني يحببكم الله ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم. This is an ayah where the Prophet ﷺ is told to say to the people, if you truly love Allah, then follow me. And then Allah will love you and forgive your sins. So this is chapter